The moment Victoria Whitmore called me just a simple schoolteacher, I knew she had no idea who I really was. We were standing in her mansion, her 15-acre estate with crystal chandeliers and champagne that cost more than I'd earned in a month of teaching. She looked at my $50 dress from Macy's and laughed, actually laughed. "Teaching must be so fulfilling," she said, her diamond necklace catching the light. "When you don't aim for more in life, I suppose you learn to settle." My daughter Sarah squeezed my hand nervously. She was terrified I'd say something, make a scene, embarrass her in front of her new husband's wealthy family. But I just smiled, because Victoria Whitmore had no idea that 20 years ago, I built everything she was standing in. Every dollar in her bank account, every business strategy that made her family rich, every connection that gave them power. I created it all. And then her husband's family stole it from me, threatened me, and paid me to disappear. They thought I'd stay gone forever. They were wrong. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, kindly subscribe and like so that we will reach many other people who feel underestimated. If Margaret Hayes could do it, they can too. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 62 years old. I taught high school English in Denver for 25 years. But before that, before they forced me to choose between my career and my daughter's safety, I was Margaret Brennan, the investigative journalist who exposed the biggest corporate corruption scandal in American history. And I was the woman who built the Whitmore empire from nothing. Now my daughter had married into this family, and I was watching them destroy everything I created through lies, fraud, and corruption. It was time to remind them who actually built their world, and what happens when the real creator decides to take it all back. This is my story. The Whitmores lived in a world I'd never been part of. Their estate was the kind you see in magazines, the kind that makes you wonder who actually lives like this. 15 acres of manicured lawns, a house so big you could get lost in it. But I wasn't intimidated. I'd seen wealth before. I'd investigated it. I'd exposed it. And I knew that underneath all the polish and perfection, there was usually something rotten. 22 years ago, I was Margaret Brennan, one of the top investigative journalists in the country. I was building my career, exposing corruption, making a difference. And I was in love with Richard Whitmore, Charles's younger brother. We'd met at Columbia University. He was brilliant. I was driven. Together, we were unstoppable. We created business plans, investment strategies, financial models that could revolutionize corporate structure. It was all my work, my research, my vision. But when Richard's family found out he was serious about me, a journalist from a working-class family with no money and no connections, they made their position clear. I wasn't suitable for the Whitmore family, so they gave me a choice. Take a substantial payout and disappear, change my name, start over, or they'd destroy my reputation, ruin my journalism career, and make sure I never worked again. I was 3 months pregnant with Sarah at the time, so I took the money, changed my name to Hayes, my grandmother's maiden name, moved to Denver, became a teacher, and I stayed silent for 20 years. Because that's what mothers do. We sacrifice everything to protect our children. But I never forgot, and I never stopped watching. Victoria looked at me the way wealthy women of her generation often look at working women like me, with pity mixed with contempt. "A teacher," she said, her voice dripping with false admiration. "How noble. I always say teaching is such important work for people who enjoy that sort of thing." Her friends giggled. Her husband smirked. "Teaching must be so fulfilling," she said, her diamond necklace catching the light. "When you don't aim for more in life, I suppose you learn to settle. Amidst a life." She had no idea that the midst-a-life teacher standing in front of her had once been one of the most feared investigative journalists in America, that I'd brought down Fortune 500 CEOs, that I'd testified before Congress, that I'd built the very business empire she was using to look down on me. But I smiled and said nothing. Not yet, because I'd learned something important over 20 years of teaching. Timing is everything, and Victoria Whitmore's timing was about to run out. Later that night, Sarah broke down in tears. "Mom, I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "Victoria treats me like I'm not good enough, like I don't belong in their world because I didn't grow up with money." I held my daughter, feeling a rage I hadn't felt in 20 years, because this was exactly what had happened to me. A working-class woman told she wasn't suitable for the Whitmore family, and now they were doing it to my daughter. "Alexander loves you," I said carefully, "but you need to know something about his family." Sarah looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "They're not what they seem," I continued. "The money, the power, the reputation, it's all built on lies." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. I took a deep breath. It was time to tell her the truth. "Sweetheart, I haven't been completely honest with you about my past. Before I was a teacher, before we moved to Denver, I was someone else." And I told her everything. About Margaret Brennan, the journalist, about Richard Whitmore, about the work I'd done that built the Whitmore empire, about the threats, about the choice I'd made to protect her. By the end, Sarah was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. "You built their company?" she whispered. "Every strategy they use, every business model, every connection, that was my work 22 years ago. And Richard's family stole it from me, claimed it as their own, and paid me to disappear." "Oh my God, Mom," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Does Alexander know?" "No one knows," I replied. "I've kept this secret for 20 years. But now that you're part of this family, now that I'm watching Victoria treat you the same way they treated me, I can't stay silent anymore." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, fear and hope mixing in her voice. I smiled, and Sarah later told me it was the first time she'd ever seen me look dangerous. "I'm going to take back what they stole," I said simply, "and I'm going to make sure they can never do this to anyone else again." I didn't leak the documents all at once. That would have been too easy, too quick. Instead, I did what I'd always done as a journalist. I built an airtight case. For 3 weeks, I worked quietly. Early mornings before anyone else woke up. Late nights after everyone had gone to bed. I contacted old sources, former colleagues at the SEC, journalists I'd worked with decades ago who still owed me favors. I provided them with documents, not leaked, but legally obtained through Freedom of Information requests and public records that Charles had been too arrogant to hide properly. I showed them patterns, connections, evidence of insider trading going back years, and I gave them something else. My original business plans from 22 years ago with my signature and dated timestamps. Proof that the Whitmore empire had been built on stolen work. The first article appeared in the Wall Street Journal on a Tuesday morning. Whitmore Industries under federal investigation, questions about company's origins. Victoria called me immediately, screaming, "You did this! You destroyed us!" "No, Victoria," I said calmly. "Charles destroyed you. I just made sure the truth came out." "Why?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Why now?" "Because you made my daughter feel the same way your family made me feel 22 years ago. Like she wasn't good enough. Like she didn't belong in their world." I paused, letting that sink in. I stayed silent for 20 years to protect Sarah. But when I saw you treating her the same way, I realized staying silent was actually hurting her. She needed to know the truth, and so did everyone else. Victoria was crying now, real tears, not the calculated tears she used for social advantage. "What do you want from us?" she whispered. "Justice," I said simply, "and acknowledgement. I want the truth on record. I want my name, my real name, Margaret Brennan, associated with the work I actually did, and I want Charles to face consequences for the crimes he's committed." There was a long silence. "And my son, Alexander?" she asked quietly. "Alexander is a good man. He's nothing like his father. He and Sarah can rebuild the company the right way, with integrity, without corruption."
"You're going to destroy everything I've worked for," she said, her voice hollow. "No," I corrected gently. "I'm giving you a chance to build something real, something honest, something that doesn't require looking down on people like me to make yourself feel important."
I hung up. Over the next month, everything I'd set in motion played out exactly as I'd planned. Charles was indicted on multiple counts of securities fraud. The SEC investigation expanded, uncovering decades of illegal trading. Media coverage intensified, with journalists digging deeper into the company's origins and finding my name, my work, my contribution that had been deliberately buried. Alexander voluntarily stepped down as heir apparent and cooperated fully with investigators. And Victoria surprised me. Instead of fighting, instead of trying to maintain appearances, she issued a public statement acknowledging my role in building Whitmore Industries. She apologized, publicly, for the way her family had treated me. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo 20 years of silence and sacrifice, but it was something. It was the truth, finally spoken aloud. A year later, I was back in Denver, sitting in my small house, the same house I'd lived in for 20 years while raising Sarah on a teacher's salary. The Whitmore Foundation for Ethical Business Practices had been launched. I was the founding chairperson, working remotely most of the time. Charles was in federal prison, serving 8 years. Alexander and Sarah were running Whitmore Industries with transparency and integrity that had actually restored investor confidence. Victoria had stepped away from her society queen role and was doing real charitable work, not for status, but because she'd finally learned what actually mattered. And I was content. Not happy, exactly. 20 years of stolen credit can't be undone, but content. One afternoon, my old colleague from my journalism days called. "Margaret," she said, "I've been approached by a publisher. They want to do a book about your story. The journalist who built a billion-dollar empire was forced into hiding and came back 20 years later to expose the truth." I was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," I said slowly, "that my story isn't about revenge. It's not even really about justice, though that was part of it." "Then what's it about?" she asked. I looked out my window at the Denver sunset, the same view I'd had for 20 years while I'd been just a teacher, just a mother, just someone who'd been forced to give up everything to protect her daughter. "It's about sacrifice," I said finally, "and about knowing when it's time to stop sacrificing and start speaking truth." "That's a good message," my colleague said. "It is," I agreed, "but I don't think I'm ready to write it yet. Maybe someday, when Sarah's children are old enough to understand that their grandmother wasn't just a teacher." "You were never just a teacher," my colleague said firmly. "Teaching is one of the most important things you can do." I smiled. "You're right, and I'm proud of those 25 years. I helped thousands of students find their voices, think critically, challenge assumptions. You did that before you were a teacher, too, as a journalist." "True," I acknowledged, "but as a teacher, I did it quietly, without fame or recognition, just because it was right." After we hung up, I sat with that thought for a while. Maybe the most powerful thing I'd ever done wasn't exposing corporate corruption. It wasn't even building a billion-dollar business model. Maybe it was choosing to live quietly for 20 years, raising my daughter with integrity, teaching students to think for themselves, and waiting for the right moment to speak truth to power. Because real power isn't about how loudly you speak. It's about knowing when to speak and when to be silent. And after 62 years, I'd finally learned that lesson. The truth had taken 20 years to surface, but it had surfaced.
And sometimes that's all you can ask for. Justice for myself, protection for my daughter, and a legacy built on honesty instead of stolen credit. At 62 years old, sitting in my modest house in Denver, I'd finally become the woman I was always meant to be. Not despite the 20 years of silence, but because of them. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon you have isn't exposure. It's patience. And when the time is right, the truth you've been quietly holding becomes unstoppable. Victoria Whitmore learned that. Charles Whitmore learned that. And now maybe their children would build something better because of it. That's all any mother can hope for. To leave the world a little better than she found it, even if it takes 20 years to do it.